"What's your business here?" The officer's voice was sharp, eyes scanning Barack Obama with suspicion. Dressed in a simple baseball cap and glasses, Obama had hoped to take a quiet walk. No security, no fanfare. But to these officers, he was just another black man in the wrong neighborhood. "Just taking a walk," he replied calmly. The officer's stare hardened. "ID, now!" The air grew thick with tension. This wasn't just a routine stop. But when their boss found out who they had just harassed, everything would change. What would you do in this situation? Have you ever faced unfair treatment? Comment where you're watching from, like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The neighborhood was serene, homes lined up in neat rows, lawns trimmed with care, and the quiet hum of everyday life hanging in the air. Modest houses, each with a white picket fence or a well-tended garden, gave off a sense of stability and calm. The small, local stores were a staple of the area, their signs faded but reliable. There was a rhythm to this place, a routine that was never interrupted until now. In a neighborhood like this, where nothing out of the ordinary seemed to happen, the presence of the police officers was expected. They patrolled these streets daily, their cars cruising down the avenues like clockwork, ensuring that order was maintained in the midst of any minor disruptions. The officers were a familiar sight, their presence comforting to some, a subtle reminder of authority to others. But under the calm surface, there was something else, something unspoken. The streets, while peaceful, weren't free of tension. It was the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves. You minded your business, unless, of course, you didn't fit in. And in this moment, Barack Obama, walking quietly through the neighborhood, was about to discover how quickly that unspoken tension could erupt into something more dangerous. Barack Obama entered the scene, a man in his early 60s, his posture and demeanor still radiating the wisdom and experience earned over decades of public life. Yet today, he wasn't the former president that the world once knew. He wore a simple disguise, a baseball cap pulled low over his brow and dark glasses, hoping to remain unnoticed, to just be another face in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Though his intention was to blend in, Obama's presence couldn't help but spark attention. Even under the disguise, there was something magnetic about him. His steps were measured, controlled, as if each stride carried the weight of not only his history, but the unspoken pressures of being a public figure. The calmness in his movements was juxtaposed by a subtle undercurrent of tension. He wasn't just a man walking through the neighborhood. He was a black man, visibly different from the residents here, in a place where his presence seemed out of place. Despite his years of experience with the spotlight, Obama felt something was different today. His calm, controlled exterior seemed to clash with the storm brewing around him. He wasn't just Barack Obama in that moment. He was just another black man trying to navigate a world that still saw him through a different lens, a lens shaped by race and perception. Officer Johnson, the leader of the patrol group, stood out from the rest. With his air of quiet authority, his expression was calm, but there was something beneath the surface, something that radiated superiority. The moment his eyes landed on Obama, there was no mistaking it. This man did not belong in his neighborhood. It was subtle at first, just a glance, a furrowed brow, but the judgment was immediate. Johnson's questions were quick and sharp, a flurry of suspicion directed at Obama without cause. "What's your business here?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made the question sound more like an accusation than an inquiry. Obama, ever composed, kept his response measured. "Just taking a walk," he said calmly, but the officer wasn't satisfied. His tone grew condescending, dripping with a hidden malice. "You don't look like you're from around here," he said, clearly trying to provoke a response. The officer's Body language spoke volumes, his stance rigid, his arms folded across his chest as if to assert dominance. It wasn't about the law. It was about the power dynamic between them. Johnson's bias was clear, though he masked it under the pretense of routine questioning. The discomfort in the air thickened with each word, as Obama tried to keep his composure amidst the growing tension. As Officer Johnson continued his aggressive questioning, Officer Thompson, the younger officer in the group, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of discomfort. He had been on the force long enough to know when something wasn't right, but his hesitation to act was palpable. He watched Obama carefully, noticing how he maintained his composure in the face of undue aggression. Thompson's gaze flickered between his colleague and the man being questioned. There was something about the way Johnson treated Obama, something that felt wrong. Thompson fidgeted, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Every word Johnson spoke, every pointed question, made him uneasy. He had always believed in fairness, in justice, yet now, as he stood there watching the situation unfold, his commitment to those values was being tested. He could feel the internal conflict within him, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent and follow his colleague's lead. The longer the confrontation continued, the more Thompson began to question the motives behind his colleague's actions. Meanwhile, Sergeant Davis's presence loomed in the background. Though he was not yet on the scene, his reputation as a by-the-book officer who valued order and fairness left an impression on the team. If Davis were here, Thompson couldn't help but think things might be different. The tension between Obama and the officers grew thicker with every passing moment. Officer Johnson's questions were no longer merely inquiries. They were accusations dressed as curiosity. "What brings you around here?" he asked with a sharp edge, his eyes scanning Obama's face as if trying to find fault in every feature. His tone was cold, calculating. Obama remained calm, his voice steady. "I'm just passing through, no harm done." It was a simple answer, yet it was as though it was never enough for Officer Johnson. The officer's eyes roamed over Obama from head to toe, his suspicion palpable. Obama could feel the weight of each glance, the scrutiny that suggested he didn't belong here. His heart raced, but he kept his composure. This was not unfamiliar territory for him. He'd been questioned, profiled, and judged countless times in his life, but this moment felt different. There was something deliberate in Johnson's approach, something meant not just to interrogate, but to humiliate. It was an intentional display of power. As Obama stood his ground, Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably. His silence spoke volumes. He saw it too, the injustice, the unfairness in his colleagues' actions, but the fear of speaking out rooted him to the spot. The longer this dragged on, the more the weight of guilt began to press down on him. What would you do if you were in Obama's shoes, facing suspicion and aggression simply because of the way you look? Would you remain calm, or would you feel the urge to fight back? And if you were a bystander, witnessing the injustice unfolding before you, how would you respond? Would you speak up or stay silent out of fear? What do you think it takes to stand up for what's right in moments like these? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The tension between Obama and Officer Johnson grew by the second. What had started as a routine question had escalated into something much darker, and Officer Johnson seemed intent on pushing it further. Obama's calm responses were met with more antagonism, each word from Johnson designed to provoke, to test his composure. "What's a man like you doing here?" Johnson sneered, his voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "This doesn't seem like your usual neighborhood." The words stung, but Obama kept his cool. "I'm just passing through," he said evenly, not wanting to give the officer any more reason to escalate things, but Johnson wasn't interested in calm conversation. His eyes narrowed, as if he had already decided who Obama was. "Passing through? A man like you doesn't just pass through places like this. What's really going on? What are you hiding?" Obama took a deep breath, the weight of the officer's suspicion bearing down on him. "I'm not hiding anything," Obama said, his voice still steady. "I told you, I'm just walking, no harm done." But Johnson was relentless, his words sharp and accusatory. His questions grew more pointed, his tone escalating. "You expect me to believe that? Just a regular man walking through a neighborhood where you clearly don't belong?" He stepped closer, his body language aggressive. "What's your real business here? What are you really up to?" Each question, each accusation seemed designed to tear away the calm veneer Obama had so carefully crafted. Obama, who had spent his entire life learning to manage public scrutiny, felt the familiar pang of injustice. But this time, it was worse. This wasn't just the public eye. This was an officer of the law questioning his very right to exist in this space. Obama tried again, but his voice was quieter now, weighed down by frustration. "I told you, I'm just walking." The officer's disdain deepened. "Right. Just a walk. You expect me to believe that?" It was clear that Johnson wasn't looking for an explanation. He was looking for an excuse to treat Obama as guilty, an excuse to label him an outsider, an excuse to continue this harassment. The heat in the air grew thicker, and with it, Obama's sense of helplessness. His attempts to de-escalate only made things worse. The officer didn't care about the truth. To him, Obama was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that, it seemed, was enough to make him guilty in the officer's eyes. As the confrontation between Obama and Officer Johnson escalated, more and more people in the neighborhood began to take notice. The once quiet street was no longer peaceful. A few bystanders, who had been going about their daily routines, paused to watch the tense exchange. Some discreetly pulled out their phones, starting to record the interaction, while others stood, frozen, unsure of what was unfolding before them. The weight of the moment settled heavily in the air. The discomfort among the bystanders was palpable. A whisper here, a murmured comment there, and a growing sense of unease started to ripple through the crowd. It wasn't long before people began to express their concern, quietly at first, but the tension in their voices was unmistakable. Some stood on tiptoe, straining to hear. Others exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. They were witnessing something unfolding that didn't sit right with them. Obama could feel their eyes on him, the quiet judgment of 100 strangers, all watching, waiting for something to happen. But despite their gaze, his focus remained, fixed firmly on Officer Johnson and his escalating aggression. He knew this wasn't just a random stop. It was an act driven by bias and suspicion, and he refused to let it rattle him. The crowd, which had been silent, began to murmur, sensing the injustice of the situation. It wasn't just about what was happening to Obama. It was about what they had witnessed for so long. Injustice lurking just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. The whispers grew louder as the crowd began to voice their discomfort. One person called out, "Hey, is everything okay?" Instead of calming the situation, their attempt to intervene was met with harsh hostility from Officer Johnson. "Mind your business," he snapped, his voice filled with authority. His eyes scanned the crowd, and the officers shifted their focus to the bystanders. The tone had changed. Now, it wasn't just Obama being intimidated, it was everyone who dared to question the officer's actions. The crowd, sensing the escalation, grew tense. No one stepped forward directly, their collective anxiety rising in the face of the officer's authority. The power imbalance was clear. Speak up, and you risk being silenced. Obama stood there, still calm, but now visibly frustrated. This wasn't just about him anymore. The situation was a reflection of a broader societal issue, the unspoken prejudices that dictated how people were treated. The crowd, the officers, Obama. This was a snapshot of the systemic challenges that people faced every day, just beneath the surface of society. This moment wasn't just a catalyst for Obama. It was a mirror for the community, and for those watching, the truth was becoming undeniable. As Officer Johnson's words grew more biting, Obama found himself torn in two directions. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had been here before, countless times, in fact. The weight of public scrutiny, the whispers of prejudice that followed him through his entire career, were no strangers to him. Yet this moment felt different. There was something uniquely suffocating about it. On one hand, Obama felt the overwhelming urge to de-escalate, to avoid any confrontation that might spiral further. He was all too aware of the dangers of an altercation with law enforcement, especially when it was driven by racial bias. He'd learned long ago how easily a peaceful situation could turn violent, how quickly his calm demeanor could be mistaken for defiance. Safety was paramount, but then there was the other side of him, the part that understood the broader stakes of this encounter. This wasn't just about his personal safety. This was a moment that represented something much larger, something that had followed him throughout his life and his career. The weight of systemic racism hung heavy in the air. He wasn't just walking through a neighborhood, he was walking through a history of prejudice, a history that had never let him rest. The thought of being silenced, of being pushed aside because of the color of his skin, gnawed at him. He had worked so hard to prove his worth, to defy the stereotypes that had been placed upon him. Yet here he was, once again, being treated as a suspect, as an outsider, simply because of who he was. He had been asked to prove himself time and time again, despite all his achievements, despite the title he had once held, despite the history he had made. It had never been enough. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to keep his composure. He couldn't let the anger and frustration break through. Not yet. But the emotional weight of it all threatened to consume him. The bitterness of feeling betrayed by the very society that once celebrated him burned deep within him. The frustration of being doubted at every turn, despite his intelligence, his ability, his character, felt like a constant reminder that he would never be free from the judgment of others. Yet amidst the turmoil, Obama knew what he had to do. He couldn't remain silent. Not this time. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for the countless others who faced the same prejudice every day. For them, he couldn't back down. The internal struggle, the weight of the moment, it was all part of a much larger fight. The hostility between Obama and the officers rippled outward, sending waves of unease through the crowd that had slowly gathered. What had started as a simple questioning had transformed into an ordeal that no one could ignore. The air became thick with fear, thick with the tension of watching a confrontation escalate. Some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their hands in their pockets or crossed in front of them, as they tried to make sense of what was happening. A few of them exchanged glances, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether they could do anything at all. Obama's voice remained calm, his explanations logical and simple, but the officers weren't listening. Officer Johnson's questions now felt more like attacks. Each word was another challenge to Obama's right to exist in this space, in this neighborhood, simply because of his race. "What are you really doing here?" Johnson asked again, his eyes narrow and accusing. Obama had explained himself multiple times, but it was as if nothing he said mattered. The crowd, which had been standing back in quiet observation, began to stir. A few brave souls stepped forward, offering their support, voicing their concerns about what they were witnessing. "This isn't right," one person called out, their voice shaking with uncertainty, but still filled with the need to speak up. Obama caught their eye, but his heart sank as he watched the officer's response. "Stay out of it," Officer Johnson growled, his voice low and threatening. The person quickly retreated, the fear of retaliation far stronger than their desire to help. The officer's words stung like a slap, and the crowd froze. For a moment there was only silence. Others looked on from the sidelines, caught in the tension between wanting to help and the very real fear of stepping in. Obama's frustration grew, not just because of the officer's relentless actions, but because he could see it, the silent acknowledgement from the crowd that this wasn't right, but no one felt empowered enough to do anything. The bystander's fear was palpable, and it weighed heavily on him. He realized that even though some people knew what was happening wasn't just, they were paralyzed by the fear of challenging authority. The situation was isolating. He wasn't just up against the officers anymore. He was up against the quiet complicity of a system that allowed injustice to thrive. The weight of this truth began to settle heavily on Obama's shoulders. The emotional isolation was suffocating. He was standing in front of the people who were meant to support the community, but they were all too afraid to act. It was the rawest form of exclusion, knowing that people could see the injustice but felt powerless to fight back. As the situation continued to spiral, Officer Thompson's discomfort became undeniable. Standing beside Officer Johnson, who was now nearly shouting at Obama, Thompson could feel the weight of the injustice bearing down on him. His colleagues' increasingly aggressive behavior made the air thick with tension, and Thompson's unease grew with each passing moment. He shifted on his feet, glancing away from the scene in an attempt to escape the weight of the moment. His fingers fidgeted at his sides, his eyes darting toward the crowd, the officers, and then back to Obama. But the more he tried to distance himself from the uncomfortable reality unfolding in front of him, the more it tugged at his conscience. He could feel the judgment, even if it was only in his own mind. He was supposed to be part of the force that protected and served, yet here he was, standing idly by as his colleague abused his power. Thompson's internal conflict was palpable. He knew deep down that this situation was wrong. He had seen enough to recognize when authority was being misused, but speaking up felt like a betrayal of his own colleagues, of his place in the force. The fear of retribution haunted him. What if he was labeled as disloyal? What if it cost him his career? He had been raised to respect the law, but now the law felt like it was standing in opposition to what was right. The more he watched, the more his hesitation ate at him. The knowledge that silence only served to perpetuate the problem gnawed at him. He knew the system wasn't perfect, but inaction only reinforced the injustice. Yet Thompson didn't know how to navigate this. He was a part of the system, and the system was built on rules and structures that upheld these kinds of behaviors. How could he challenge it without losing everything he'd worked for? His hesitation wasn't just about fear of retaliation. It was about being caught between what was right and what was easy. His unwillingness to speak up, to confront the obvious wrongdoing, mirrored a much larger issue: the complicity of those who know something is wrong but are too afraid to act. In the end, Thompson stood there torn, as Obama faced the full weight of not only his colleagues' hostility, but the silent complicity of everyone around him. Do you think racism is something that is learned, or is it innate in society? How should we respond when we witness injustice, especially when it's uncomfortable to act? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. The moment of calm Obama had desperately clung to was slipping away. His attempts to explain, to reason with the officers, were no longer met with understanding, but with increasing aggression. Officer Johnson's voice was no longer just skeptical. It was filled with contempt. Each question, each accusation, seemed designed to provoke, and Obama felt the weight of his entire life's experiences bearing down on him. "What's your real business here, huh?" Johnson snapped, his tone now accusatory and dismissive. "You expect me to believe that you're just passing through? People like you don't just pass through places like this." Obama stood tall, his breath steady, despite the rage welling up inside him. "I've told you, I'm just walking," he said calmly. "There's nothing more to it." But Johnson wasn't listening anymore. His gaze was fixed on Obama, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "You're lying. I'm going to arrest you if you don't tell me the truth." The words stung like a slap to the face, but Obama refused to let them break his composure. He knew the moment had come. He could feel it in the air, the way the officers had moved from interrogation to a dangerous kind of authority. The stakes were higher now, the tension almost unbearable. Johnson's hostility had shifted into something more deliberate, more dangerous. Obama's mind raced. He had always been able to control the situation with reason, with calm, but not this time. The officers were determined to escalate, to force his hand. He could feel the handcuffs being slipped over his wrists, the cold metal a cruel reminder of the unjust treatment he had been subjected to. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, about to be arrested for walking down the street. A rush of emotions surged through him: anger, disbelief, frustration. He had been patient his entire life, quiet in the face of prejudice, always choosing to rise above. But this was different. His patience had run out. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he had endured, and everything that countless others continued to endure. The injustice was too much to ignore. With the handcuffs now in place, Obama's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act. Not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been silenced. The time for quiet submission was over. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger problem, a systemic issue that he had to confront head-on. This was no longer just about being arrested. This was the beginning of the next step in the fight for justice. Obama braced himself for what was to come, ready to face the battle that had shaped so much of his life. Just as the confrontation teetered dangerously close to escalating further, a figure appeared at the end of the street. The tension in the air grew taut, as though the entire moment was frozen, waiting for something to break. Then, without warning, Sergeant Davis arrived, his presence commanding immediate attention. Davis quickly assessed the situation, his eyes scanning from Obama to Officer Johnson, then to the other officers, who stood rigid with authority. The calm in his posture contrasted sharply with the scene before him. His sharp gaze landed on Obama, and despite the simple disguise, a baseball cap and glasses, the flicker of recognition passed across his face. He knew who the man standing before him was. Without hesitation, Davis stepped forward, his voice booming with the authority that only years of experience could bring. "Stand down, all of you." The shift was immediate. The officers froze, their aggressive stances faltering as they absorbed the sudden change in command. For a brief moment, the air around them seemed to relax, though the unease was far from gone. Johnson, still visibly frustrated and unwilling to let go of the control he believed he had, protested. "Sergeant, this man—" Johnson began, his voice tight with frustration. But Davis cut him off with a firm, unwavering tone. "I know who he is, Johnson," Davis said, his eyes narrowing as he turned his full attention to the handcuffed man in front of him. There was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "Now, why don't you explain why you're arresting him?" The change in dynamics was immediate and jarring. Where the officers had once held all the power now, with Davis's intervention, they were on the defensive. For the first time in this exchange, the officers were not the ones controlling the narrative. There was nowhere for them to hide, no justification for their actions, no way to explain away the harassment they had inflicted. Johnson's protestations fell on deaf ears as Davis's scrutiny bore down on them. Obama, still in handcuffs, stood quietly, unsure of what would come next, but feeling the heavy weight of the moment. The intervention was unexpected, but he couldn't deny that it was a turning point. This was the first real crack in the system he had long fought against, and he wasn't sure how it would unfold. Would Davis uphold the law, or was this just another example of authority being wielded without consequence? With Sergeant Davis now in control, the immediate threat of further escalation faded, but the tension was far from over. Obama stood there, still handcuffed, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His body was calm, but his mind was racing. For so long he had endured this kind of injustice, disguised in polite questions and veiled hostility. But now, in this moment, something inside him shifted. Turning toward Officer Johnson, the man who had relentlessly harassed him, Obama's voice broke the silence with a quiet authority. "What gives you the right to treat me like this?" he demanded, his words carrying an unspoken weight that felt like it had been building for years. The shift in Obama was palpable. No longer was he just the victim of an unjust situation. No longer was he simply responding to the treatment he had been subjected to. This was his moment. This was the moment he decided to confront the prejudice that had followed him his entire life. His words were calm but filled with quiet rage, the kind that could only come from a lifetime of fighting for equality and dignity. "I've spent my life fighting for justice, equality, and the belief that every individual deserves to be treated with respect," Obama continued, his eyes locking with Officer Johnson's, refusing to look away. "But this is not justice. This is racism. This is an abuse of power." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment there was only silence. The crowd, which had been watching the scene unfold, seemed to hold its collective breath. Obama's voice, though steady, had struck a chord. Johnson, visibly uncomfortable, shifted on his feet, unable to meet Obama's gaze. The raw honesty, in Obama's words, had done what the formalities and calmness could not. The power dynamics had shifted. For the first time in this encounter, it was not the officers who controlled the narrative. It was Obama. Obama was no longer the subject of the officers' scorn. He was now the one confronting them with the truth. He was no longer the man being silenced. He was speaking truth to power, challenging the very system that had for so long treated him as less than equal. As Obama's words echoed through the tense air, it became clear that this moment was not just about the immediate confrontation. His voice, though steady, was laced with a raw emotion that could no longer be contained. This was not just a conversation with Officer Johnson. It was a culmination of every instance in his life when his worth had been questioned, when his every action had been scrutinized, simply because of the color of his skin. "I've been treated this way for years," Obama said, his voice trembling slightly, the weight of his own truth pressing down on him. The words carried the burden of a lifetime. Every time he'd been judged without cause, every time he'd been forced to prove himself when others were given the benefit of the doubt. His hands, though still bound by the handcuffs, shook with the intensity of the emotions he was confronting. "Not because of anything I've done," he continued, his voice growing stronger now, "but because of the color of my skin. And I won't stand for it anymore. I won't let this be the example for the next generation." His words reverberated in the heavy silence that followed, a challenge not just to Officer Johnson, but to the very system that had allowed this kind of treatment to persist unchecked. The officers, once so certain of their control, now stood exposed, their actions laid bare. There was no denying the truth in Obama's words. The weight of systemic racism, the daily struggles, the subtle and overt prejudices that shaped every interaction, whether they were aware of it or not. Officer Thompson, who had been silent throughout much of the ordeal, finally glanced up, his eyes avoiding Obama's, his feet shifting nervously on the ground. He couldn't meet Obama's gaze, not because he didn't understand the truth, but because the reality of what he was witnessing was too difficult to confront. The silence that followed Obama's statement was deafening. The crowd, still gathered at the edges, waited in anticipation. It was a moment that felt suspended in time. This wasn't just a man confronting an officer. It was a moment where an entire society's conscience was laid bare. Obama wasn't just challenging Officer Johnson in that moment. He was challenging the society that allowed these injustices to continue, the institutions that perpetuated them. His voice rang with power, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been silenced in the face of discrimination. The moment of transformation in Obama was undeniable, as though a switch had flipped. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface throughout this encounter, the weight of years of prejudice and injustice, came pouring out in a rush of raw emotion. As he spoke, Obama shed the weight of victimhood, no longer content to simply endure the harassment he had faced. This moment was not just about defending himself. It was about something far more profound. Obama no longer stood there as a man trying to escape a difficult situation. He stood as an advocate, a voice rising against a system that had continuously oppressed him and countless others. His words, now sharp and resonant, carried the power of a lifetime of experiences. The microaggressions, the doubts cast on his abilities, the racism he had faced time and time again. Every word he spoke echoed with the collective pain and struggle of those who had been silenced, ignored, or marginalized. This was no longer just about one individual. The atmosphere around him shifted, as if the air itself grew heavier with the significance of the moment. As Obama's voice rose, so did the energy in the crowd. What had been silent witnesses to an injustice now felt the surge of something greater than themselves. The crowd, once unsure and hesitant, now felt emboldened by the raw truth in Obama's words. His words weren't just a plea for himself. They were a call for action, a call for systemic change. Even Sergeant Davis, who had been quiet until now, observed the exchange with a new sense of respect. He saw not just a man in handcuffs, but a man standing up for what was right, speaking truth to the oppressive force that had been allowed to persist for far too long. Though he remained silent, there was a subtle shift in his posture, an understanding of the injustice that had been done. In this moment, Obama was no longer just a victim of prejudice. He was the embodiment of resilience, of justice, of someone using his position, his voice, to catalyze change. This moment marked not just a confrontation with one officer, but a confrontation with the societal systems that had allowed such behavior to go unchallenged for so long. Obama had become not just a survivor, but an advocate. And in doing so, he had transformed the situation into a powerful call for justice. Have you ever felt powerless in a moment of injustice? How do you think this situation could have been handled differently? And what would you do if you were in Obama's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. The weight of the confrontation lingered in the air long after Obama's powerful words had dissipated. Sergeant Davis stood at the heart of the moment, silently processing what had just unfolded. His gaze shifted between the officers and Obama, still standing there, handcuffed but undeterred. Davis could feel the shift within himself, the growing understanding of the depth of what had occurred. This wasn't just a single instance of misconduct, it was a snapshot of a system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for far too long. Officer Johnson's actions, his escalating aggression, had finally crossed a line. But this wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about the collective blind spots that had allowed Johnson's treatment of Obama to spiral into an outright violation of decency. In this moment, Davis couldn't pretend that this was an isolated incident. It was a manifestation of the deep-seated systemic flaws that permeated the department. Flaws that Davis himself had been too comfortable overlooking for far too long. Davis had always prided himself on being a law-abiding officer, someone who understood the importance of fairness and order. But now, as the weight of the situation settled over him, He realized just how deeply those ideals had been compromised. He could no longer ignore the discomfort in his gut. The department he worked for, the institution he had trusted, was just as complicit in allowing this behavior to persist. For the first time, he was forced to see it for what it was, a system that failed not only Obama, but everyone who was vulnerable to its biases. His gaze fell on Officer Johnson, still seething with frustration, his posture rigid with defiance. Davis could feel the tension in the air, the hesitation in his colleague's eyes. Johnson was the embodiment of the problem. He wasn't simply a rogue officer acting out of turn. He was a product of the system itself, a system that had, for too long, placed people like Obama at a disadvantage. But now, with his back against the wall, Johnson was about to face the consequences of his actions. Davis took a deep breath, a moment of clarity washing over him. Without hesitation, he turned to face the officers. "We'll be having a thorough internal review of this situation," he said, his voice stern but resolute. There was no room for ambiguity in his tone. The officers around him stood still, visibly taken aback by his sudden shift in authority. The sense of control, which had been so firmly in the hands of Johnson only moments ago, was now in Davis's grasp. As the officers processed the command, Johnson opened his mouth, ready to protest. "Sergeant, this man," he began, but Davis immediately cut him off, his tone unwavering. "I know who he is, Johnson," he said, looking him dead in the eye. His gaze was firm, his voice steady with the authority that had been called into action. "Now, why don't you explain why you're arresting him?" The power shift was immediate. The tension that had been thick in the air now seemed to crack under the weight of Davis's words. The officers stood frozen, caught off guard by the sudden change in the dynamics of the situation. Johnson, once the figurehead of authority, was now left stammering for an explanation, unable to defend the indefensible. Davis's presence in that moment, quiet yet commanding, created an unmistakable shift. For the first time, the officers stood on the defensive. They couldn't hide behind their badges, couldn't justify their actions with the same old tired rhetoric. Obama, still handcuffed but composed, watched as the officers began to process what was happening. The resolve in Davis's stance seemed to bring a slight sense of relief, but it was still unclear what would come of this moment. The battle wasn't over, but it was a turning point. It was a point of reckoning, where the officers could no longer ignore the truth that had been spoken. Davis's command was just the first step in dismantling the toxic cycle of racism and bias that had poisoned their ranks. As the officers began to gather their things, ready to head to the station. For questioning, Davis remained still, his mind already racing toward the next steps. He knew this was just the beginning. The true work of dismantling prejudice and bias within the force would require more than just an internal review. It would require a full commitment to change, something that would take time, effort, and above all, transparency. Davis wasn't naive enough to believe that a single action would fix everything, but it was a start, a much-needed start. The road ahead would be long, but the first step had been taken. Though still in disguise, Obama walked away from the scene with a deep sense of triumph. The confrontation, intense and painful as it had been, marked a turning point, not just for him, but for the larger struggle he had spent his life fighting. His pulse still raced from the tension of the moment, but beneath it all, a quiet pride began to swell within him. Despite the harassment he had endured, despite the way the officers had treated him, he knew that he had done something bigger. Today, his actions, though rooted in self-preservation, had sparked something that transcended this individual encounter. As Obama made his way down the street, his thoughts lingered on the significance of what had just occurred. The fight for justice, he knew all too well, was long and fraught with obstacles. It was a battle that required more than just physical strength. It demanded emotional resilience, the ability to withstand the weight of prejudice and hatred. And yet in this moment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His voice had been heard. He had spoken truth to power, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he had made a statement that could not be easily ignored. The weight of the injustice he faced today was not something he could simply ignore, but it was also not something that would define him. He had faced this kind of prejudice time and time again throughout his life. The countless moments where he was made to feel less than, where his achievements were overshadowed by the color of his skin, rushed through his mind. The years of proving himself, of rising above the stereotypes and biases that plagued him, had not been in vain. Today he confronted it head-on. For the first time in a long time, Obama felt a sense of release, a sense of ownership over his own narrative. The neighborhood he walked through seemed quieter now, almost too still in the aftermath of what had transpired. Yet in the silence, Obama felt a shift. This wasn't just his victory, it was a victory for every person who had faced the same kind of discrimination, the same challenges, the same system that sought to keep them down. He thought about the countless others, like him, who had to fight to be seen for who they truly were. This moment wasn't just about him, it was about raising awareness, about starting a conversation that needed to be had. And it was about creating a ripple effect of change. His mind wandered to the larger issues at play. It wasn't just the officers on the street that he was fighting against. It was the deeply ingrained societal systems that perpetuated inequality, that allowed biases to fester in every corner of the world. The systemic racism that haunted not only his life, but the lives of millions of others. Today's battle was just one in a much larger war, but it was a step, a significant step. And for today, that felt like a victory. Obama had always known that this journey wasn't easy, but in this moment, the fight didn't seem so insurmountable. It wasn't just about the injustice he had endured, it was about the possibility of change, the hope that his actions could inspire others to stand up and speak out as well. The fire that had burned within him for so long had only grown stronger. He hadn't just endured the system, he had challenged it, and he had won. In fact, days that followed the confrontation brought with them a sense of both hope and anxiety. The air felt thick with change, and though the immediate tension had dissipated, its aftershocks reverberated through the neighborhood, the police department, and, in a broader sense, society. Sergeant Davis, fully aware of the magnitude of what had just unfolded, had already begun working to ensure that the officers involved would be held accountable for their actions. The process would not be simple, and Davis was under no illusions about the difficulties that lay ahead. As an officer of the law, Davis had always prided himself on maintaining a certain level of integrity, holding his colleagues to a high standard of fairness and justice. But after the incident with Obama, Davis could no longer turn a blind eye to the broader issues that plagued the force. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a disturbing systemic pattern of behavior that had been tolerated for far too long. An internal review was immediately initiated, and the officers who had harassed Obama were now under investigation for their actions. From the outset, Davis encountered resistance. The pushback wasn't just from the officers involved, but from other members of the force who were reluctant to acknowledge that their colleagues had done anything wrong. Some saw the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding, others as a small lapse in judgment. But Davis knew better. He knew that this was not just about a single bad apple. It was about a culture that had allowed this type of behavior to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. The department had to confront this head-on, or else the cycle would only continue. The investigation revealed a shocking and deeply ingrained pattern of racial bias within the department. Officers who had once been seen as upstanding members of the force were now exposed for their role in perpetuating inequality. The internal review uncovered disturbing evidence of racial profiling, officers targeting individuals simply because of their skin color. There were records, testimonies, and cases of mistreatment that, once brought to light, painted a picture of a system deeply compromised by prejudice. As the investigation moved forward, the shockwaves were felt throughout the police force. There were whispers in the halls, tension in the precincts, and a palpable unease among those who had once viewed themselves as above reproach. But for Davis, the realization that the department he had dedicated his career to had been complicit in perpetuating these biases was a hard pill to swallow. He had to reconcile the image he once held of his colleagues with the reality that was now staring him in the face. Despite the pressure and the resistance, Davis remained resolute. He knew that holding the officers accountable was only the first step. The true challenge lay in confronting the culture that had enabled them to act with such impunity for so long. The findings of the investigation were difficult to hear, but they were necessary. The department and the community needed to hear them. Davis worked tirelessly, ensuring that every officer involved would face the consequences of their actions. The officers, once so confident in their ability to act without fear of repercussion, were now under scrutiny. Obama, though still in disguise, stayed involved in the process. Though he had been through the worst of it, he could not turn his back on the fight. He remained in the background, working closely with activists and community leaders to ensure that the officers would be held accountable. He provided his testimony, offered his insights, and continued to speak out, though quietly. His involvement, though not public, kept the momentum going. He knew that without this sustained push, the investigation could lose its focus, and the officers might be allowed to slip through the cracks. The investigation, while not perfect, marked a critical first step toward accountability. For the first time in a long time, there was a real sense that change might be possible. The officers involved faced the consequences of their actions, and the department was forced to reckon with the deep-rooted issues that had been exposed. It was not an easy or quick process. There were setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But it was progress, and that progress had sparked a sense of hope. Obama knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The fight for justice, for equality, for a fair system was not over. He had seen firsthand how hard it was to dismantle a system built on centuries of inequality. But today, there was hope that the tide was beginning to turn. The process of change had begun. Now it was up to everyone to keep pushing, to keep demanding better, to keep fighting until justice no longer had to be a struggle. Though the immediate situation had been addressed, and the officers involved were facing accountability, Obama knew in his heart that the fight for social justice could not end here. The investigation, the steps taken by Sergeant Davis, and the public attention the incident had drawn, all represented a glimmer of hope. A sign that progress was possible, but not nearly enough to erase the systemic racism that still held so many people in its grip. The sense of triumph he felt in the moment was real, but it didn't blind him to the broader implications of the incident. As he reflected on everything that had transpired, Obama knew that the problem was far deeper than one incident. It was about something that had been embedded in the fabric of society for centuries. A system of inequality that had infected nearly every facet of life. Yes, the officers had been held accountable for their actions, but the underlying systems of prejudice and bias would not be dismantled overnight. Obama understood, perhaps better than most, that change is a slow and painstaking process. He had been fighting for justice, equality, and social awareness for most of his life. And this moment, while important, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. What happened today was necessary, but it was also a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. This fight was not just for him or for those directly affected by the officer's actions. It was for future generations, for every child, who would one day inherit a world where injustice was still a reality. There was power in community, Obama reflected. The community that had witnessed the injustice, the people who had stepped forward and supported him, even when it was uncomfortable, were a testament to the fact that change could begin in the hearts of individuals. These moments, though painful and difficult, could serve as catalysts for something larger, something transformative. His own actions, rooted in self-preservation and justice, had sparked something that went beyond his personal experience. His voice had been heard, and in doing so, it had contributed to a larger movement, one that demanded more from society. He thought about the next generation, the young people who would someday walk the streets, live in the neighborhoods, and inherit the world that he and so many others had worked to shape. They were the ones who would carry the torch for justice, equality, and freedom. He felt a deep responsibility to them, to show them that change was possible, that resilience, in the face of adversity, could lead to transformation. Obama also understood that the work of justice was never truly finished. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. And even small victories were worth celebrating. Today's battle was just one in a much larger war, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was proof that when people take a stand, when they refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice, real change can happen. But the fight couldn't end with one victory. The work would have to continue. More voices, more action, and more courage would be needed to tackle the deep-rooted systems that perpetuated inequality. As Obama walked through the streets, thinking of all that had happened and all that lay ahead, he knew that the flame of change had been kindled. This was not just about him or about one incident, it was about something far larger. This moment, painful and difficult as it was, would hopefully inspire others to take action, to stand up for what was right, to challenge injustice wherever it existed. As the sun began its slow descent behind the horizon, Obama stood alone, gazing out at the sprawling city skyline before him. The vastness of the view was both humbling and powerful, a striking metaphor for the journey he had been on, a journey filled with both triumphs and obstacles. The skyline stretched far beyond what his eyes could see, a symbol of progress, of the distance that had been covered, but also of the road still ahead. The weight of everything that had transpired today pressed down on him, but with it came an undeniable sense of peace. Though still cloaked in his disguise, Obama felt an inner calm that had eluded him during the tumult of the previous hours. The events of the day had shifted the course of his own life, but more importantly, they had contributed to something far larger than himself, a movement toward justice, equality, and accountability. A moment of reckoning had come, and he knew that his role in it, however small it seemed in the grand scheme of things, had made a difference. As he stood there in quiet solitude, his mind wandered back to the countless individuals who had fought before him, those whose names would never be written in history books, whose struggles had gone unrecognized by the world, but whose sacrifices had paved the way for moments like the one he had just experienced. He thought of those who had been silenced, those who had been beaten down, and those who had never seen the fruits of their labor. Their efforts had not been in vain. Their fight had brought change, even if it had taken decades, even centuries to unfold. Obama's heart swelled with gratitude for them, the forgotten heroes who had taken the torch of justice and passed it on to the next generation. Their endurance, their resilience had created a path for people like him to stand up and speak out. It was because of their sacrifices that he was able to confront the prejudice he had faced. And it was their courage that had sparked a new flame of determination in him. He knew that this moment, though deeply personal, was part of a much larger, ongoing struggle, one that was not his alone, but one that he shared with a global community. But his reflection was also bittersweet. He knew that change, even in the face of victories, was often slow and painful. It took time, effort, and immense sacrifice. The wounds of injustice didn't heal overnight, and the systems of oppression didn't dismantle themselves. But despite the difficulties, he also knew that it was possible. He had seen it before, small steps taken over time that, when added together, led to monumental shifts. Change was hard, but it was not impossible. And though the road ahead would not be easy, the future felt just a little bit brighter now. It felt as if, with each small victory, the world was beginning to change, and with each challenge, a new opportunity for growth arose. In this moment, Obama was reminded of the power of resilience. He had spent much of his life proving himself. In a world that had often doubted him, today he had risen above that doubt, not only for himself, but for others who needed to see that standing up against injustice could spark something greater. He walked away from the confrontation, not as a victim of the system, but as an advocate, someone who had faced down oppression and used his voice to challenge the status quo. As the sun set, casting a warm, golden glow over the horizon, Obama took a deep breath. The world ahead was still uncertain, but in this moment he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The future, while unpredictable, felt hopeful. He had become not just a survivor of the system, but a beacon of hope for those who would follow in his footsteps. His journey was far from over, but for today, he could walk away, knowing that his efforts had helped create a shift, one that would continue to grow as long as there were people willing to fight for justice, equality, and the promise of a better tomorrow. What kind of change would you like to see in the world around you? How can we all contribute to creating a more just and equitable society? Change doesn't always come easily, but every step we take, no matter how small, helps to move us forward. What actions, big or small, can we all take to make a difference? Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going and inspire each other to be a part of the change. As the story comes to a close, think about the changes you want to see in the world. What steps can we all take to stand up against injustice in our own lives? If you believe that justice and equality should be at the forefront of every society, leave a comment below and let us know how you're taking action. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can make a difference.